Hello and welcome to another lecture in Anatomy 2. In fact, the last lecture that we will be doing for the semester. This will be on chapter 28, and specifically we're going to talk about the female reproductive system, and we're going to work in a little bit of development at the end, just enough to make a point. So let's blaze a trail through this relatively short lecture and see what we can get from it. Alright, here we go. So a brief introduction. The female reproductive system is vastly more complex than is the male reproductive system. The male reproductive system has a long length of tubules and interactions taking place, but the female reproductive system just has to do more things, and ergo it is vastly more complicated. I mean, think about the concept here. Whereas the male reproductive system is set up basically just to deliver sperm, the female reproductive system is set up to take those sperm and get them where they need to be, to produce gametes of its own and move them into appropriate positions for facilitating fertilization. It has to have a mechanism to harbor those developing zygotes then and allow them to develop. They must develop in utero for months of time, and then upon finally reaching maturation, the birth has to take place, and all of these things are very complicated. And then post-birth, the female system has a mechanism for nourishing that infant for years, depending upon what is necessary. So knowing this, the female system is just more complicated. There is more happening. There is more happening than, by comparison, in the male system. Now, the female system is much more cyclic. The hormones that are released are in a way more complicated sequence, and it's just a little more complicated than it is on the male side. Whereas males simply produce sperm throughout their life cycle, on the female side of things, hormones are constantly moving on a monthly cycle, and the endometrium of the uterus is constantly changing on a monthly cycle. Hormones are constantly fluctuating on a monthly cycle. It's just more complicated, all right? More complicated than it is on the male side of things. Now, with that in mind, let's go through and briefly comment about the main parts of the female reproductive system. Now, you can break the female reproductive system down into internal and external genitalia. In terms of internal genitalia, we're talking about ovaries, as you can see here. The uterine tubes or fallopian tubes, as you can see here. The uterus itself, which is this big muscular item, as you can see here. And then the vaginal opening, as you can see here. All right. Now, in terms of external genitalia, we have the clitoris at the beginning here, at the front near the pelvic bone. And again, quite analogous to the glands of the penis. The labia minora and labia majora. So the labia majora are larger and more external and analogous to the scrotum in males, and then the labia minora are more inset. Yeah. All right. And further, we can classify these. We have primary sex organs versus secondary sex organs. The primary sex organs in reproduction are obviously those which produce gametes, i.e. in the female reproductive system, the ovaries. And then the secondary sex organs are those which facilitate the mating process, and that would be everything else. All right? Everything else. All right. Beginning, let's talk about the ovaries. So if we're going to walk through the female reproductive system, we're going to do this just like we do on the male side. On the male side, we start at the testis and worked our way through. On the female side, we'll start at the ovaries and work our way through. All right, the ovaries are indeed the gonads which produce the ova, or the egg cell, and egg cells, I should say, and they do this in response to specific sex hormones which drive the development of these oocytes into varying forms of what we call ovarian follicles. All right. Now, when we look at an ovary, it looks a lot like a testis. It's got a tunica albuginea, the internal structuring, cortex, medulla. There are similarities, minor levels of similarity. However, in the ovary, that cortex is going to have piles of what are called primordial follicles. Right? These early primordial follicles. These are going to be all of the eggs that the female is born with. Okay, they're all going to be found in there in that cortex. And then there's an inner medulla, which is going to be dominated by the venous network of the ovary. Now, fascinatingly, the ovaries lack ducts, whereas in the male reproductive system, sperm are moved through a crazy variety of ducts moving through and out of the system. In the ovarian cycle, there is no duct here. So what happens is, upon maturation of a follicle containing an oocyte, that follicle, I should say, will swell and open and release an oocyte out into what we typically call extracellular space, to be picked up by the fallopian tube and carried through the fallopian tubes. I think I did that backwards. Picked up by the fimbriae and carried through the fallopian tubes into the uterus. Now, this process is called ovulation. Ovulation. We're going to be talking about it at great length. The fallopian tubes. All right. Your book, you can read these as called oviducts or uterine tubes. I call them fallopian tubes. They're named after Gabriele Falloppio, whom in the 1500s was a well-known anatomist, who sort of described the fallopian tubes by their nature. And fascinatingly, the same guy kind of came up with an early, pretty effective design for a condom for preventing pregnancy and, at this particular time, the spread of certain venereal diseases. So kind of an interesting fellow here. They're fallopian tubes from my perspective. Now, the fallopian tubes carry egg cells from the ovaries through and into the uterus. That's the idea here. If you look at them, they have extended ends here with these fimbriae, and the fimbriae are ciliated, and basically when the egg cells are released from the ovary, the fimbriae sort of have the ability to almost reach out and kind of massage the surface, if you will, of the ovary, and then use their cilia to coax an egg from the ovary into the fallopian tube. So an important point to be made here is that there's no direct connection between the ovary and the fallopian tube. It's open space. So there are cases referred to as ectopic pregnancies where copulation has occurred and sperm are in the system and an egg is released, but the egg is not picked up by the fallopian tubes. It's just kind of hovering down in space in the abdominal cavity, if you will, and it can become fertilized and attempt implantation. Obviously, this is not going to go to term, and it tends to result in a pretty rough mess, if you will, in terms of when this miscarriage takes place, but that's referred to as an ectopic pregnancy, a pregnancy that occurs when implantation, or I should say, when fertilization takes place outside of the reproductive system. So eggs can be released and just kind of fall into the abdominal cavity, as opposed to be picked up by the fimbriae here. And again, these tubules are all going to be ciliated, and they're going to be constantly pulling fluid. There's a constant flow of fluid through the fallopian tubes and into the uterus. Now, important here is to point out this ampullae up top. This is where fertilization takes place if you want to have a child. All right. So the goal is that either sperm are already hanging out in the system, or copulation takes place just after ovulation when the egg is making its way into the ampulla. This is where, in the ampullae of the fallopian tube, this is where we want fertilization to take place if we're going to have effective implantation into the endometrium of the uterus. Yeah, I think that'll do. What else do we want to say here? So, lumen of the fallopian tube. Yeah, okay. So, the lumen, the opening in the fallopian tube, can be as small as about the width of a hair. So, minor variances in the fallopian tube can cause problems. A good example of this is pelvic inflammatory disease. Multitudes of STDs can lead to inflammation and scarring of the uterine tubes. And when this happens, this can lead to infertility or a vastly decreased chance of fertility because it's difficult to get through these very small fallopian tubes. Yeah, all right. I'm going to call it there. Let's keep on rolling. All right, now we're into the uterus. So the uterus is a big, thick, muscular chamber. It's smaller than your fist, but muscular and large relatively. All the same, going to have eggs carried in from the fallopian tubes, and then it's going to terminate at this lower cervix next to the vaginal opening, or the vagina itself. All right, now, inside of the uterus, we have, or I should say, on the outside of the uterus, we have perimetrium, which is basically a serosal layer on the external surface. The middle portion of this, the uterus, is very muscular. It's got lots of smooth muscle. That's referred to as the myometrium. And then this internal lining, which is shed on a roughly 28-day cycle, is going to be referred to as the endometrium. Now, the uterus has three regions. The fundus is the upper part the body is the central core, and then the base of this is indeed the cervix. And what I want you to notice is that the cervix sort of dips down into the vaginal canal. All right, that's going to be important when we talk about how fertilization physically takes place. And I think I probably have made this point already, but the endometrium, which is shed on a roughly monthly cycle, the endometrium is this fluffy internal lining, if you will, that's going to be the site of implantation and attachment of a fertilized egg for pregnancy to take place. All right, it's going to be where the placenta attaches, that is in that endometrium. Yeah. All right, good. Let's go here. Down into the vagina. So the vagina is yet again a muscular tube between 8 and 10 centimeters in length, but it is very distensible. It can change length a great deal. This is going to allow for the discharge of menstrual fluids as well as the reception of semen and allow for the birthing of a baby. So there's a whole host of things that must take place here. So these structures have special setups to allow for those happenings. Now, the vagina itself is kind of fascinating. It has no internal glands itself. What it does is it forms lubrication via what's called transudation. Okay, that is that there is serous fluid that is kind of going to migrate through the walls of the uterus of the vagina to lead to its lubricative processes. Further, the cervix produces a mucus that will further lubricate the vagina. And externally, there are what are called Bartholin's glands associated with the labia minora, sort of on each side of the vaginal opening, and they will produce fluids which further lubricate the vagina. Now, again, no glands in the vagina, but the vagina has a pretty acidic pH, somewhere around 3.5 if I'm not mistaken, and that is caused by natural bacteria growth. Like, our whole body is covered in bacteria, top to bottom, and the vagina is no different here, but these are very special bacteria because they keep the pH low, acidic, so that more deleterious, more dangerous pathogenic bacteria can't get in. All right, so it's an important role to play. Also, inside of the vagina, there are friction ridges. There are rugae, which allow for the expansion and relaxation of the vagina, as well as a gripping strength, if you will, during copulation. And further, at the base of this, early on in development, there will be a hymen, and the hymen is there typically to prevent bacteria from getting in early on in development. All right. So where do we go from here? Well, we're going to talk about puberty real quick, and then we're going to talk about menopause. So puberty being the onset of menses, and menopause being the cessation, if you will, of the same. Now, puberty is going to start as a result of gonadotrophin releasing... dyslexia is hard. Puberty is going to start as a result of gonadotrophin releasing hormone moving down and augmenting the hypothalamus. No. Jeez, have mercy, folks. Let me try again. The hypothalamus is where gonadotrophin-releasing hormone comes from. It's going to move down into the pituitary. Then the pituitary releases luteinizing hormone and follicle-stimulating hormone. There we go. Better. So, this is the same as in males. Okay, same hormones, same setup, same everything. And I'm not going to go into huge amounts of detail. I simply want you to understand that gonadotrophin-releasing hormone causes the release from the hypothalamus, follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone from the pituitary gland. And then these are going to go down and augment the female reproductive cycle. Generally speaking, follicle-stimulating hormone causes the development of ovarian follicles. Why do we call it follicle-stimulating hormone? Because it stimulates ovarian follicles. Now, what that's going to do inadvertently is lead to the production of estrogen, progesterone, inhibin, and a whole host of other compounds. Estrogen being important here, especially at puberty, because this is going to give rise to a lot of the female secondary sexual characteristics. And then last but not least, here we have luteinizing hormone. And when luteinizing hormone spikes, it causes ovulation. Okay, so initial ovulation. And then it will lead to the production of what's referred to as a corpus luteum. You'll be seeing what that is here in just a second. You can rest assured it's incredibly important. Now, the first ovulation, if you will, the first menstrual period, this is coined menarche, okay? And that simply means first month, if you break down the Latin. And it's kind of fascinating. You know, in the past, I think 1860s is a pretty early data we have on this. Menarche occurred around 16, but today the onset of this is far lower. So again, puberty starts about 8 or 10 years old in females, earlier than males. It's just how this works. whereas menarche has gone down to about age 12, a few years afterwards, in other words. So we're preparing the system based off of hormones, and then we're finally leading to that first period. Now, people often wonder why this is, and I've heard folks in class left and right commenting about hormones and the food we eat and all kinds of stuff, and that is not how this works by any stretch of the imagination. The reality is this is based off of levels of body fat. It's a protective measure for a human to be fecund, to have the ability for fecundity, the capacity for reproduction. You have to be generally healthy. And to be generally healthy, your body fat needs to be a certain percentage based off of your age. Right? If your body fat dips below that percentage, you will cease having periods, which is why, and this is a terrible thing to comment on, but it's the truth, if you look at people who have eating disorders and their body fat drops dramatically, they tend to cease having periods for a unit of time, if you will, as a result of this here. So we only will be capable of producing offspring when we are generally healthy, and the way that the body gauges that health is based off of leptin, or the amount of fat in the system. All right, and because we have a vastly better, well, a vastly more nutrient-rich diet these days, I'll say that, that means that we tend to have more body fat earlier, and that's why we see earlier onset of menarche. All right. And then moving on to climacteric or menopause. Climacteric simply means a climax of something, an end result, a final outcome, if you will. Oftentimes folks just talk about menopause. What we're trying to get at here is a cessation of menstruation where you cease releasing eggs from the ovaries. Now, what's going on here? When you are born, you got millions of eggs. This process, menopause, is going to occur when there are very, very few left. And what's happening here is the body's becoming way less responsive, I should say, to the gonadotrophins, being follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. Side effect of not being responsive to the gonadotrophins means less estrogen produced in the ovaries. Okay, less of this means less of that, and less progesterone being secreted as a result of no corpus luteums. Okay, as a side effect of this, the uterus, the vagina, the breast, they atrophy. Okay, they're all playing off of these hormones, so they're going to atrophy as a result of this. Side effect of that is the intercourse becomes quite painful as a result of the vagina becoming thinner and less distensible and having fewer secretions. And as a result of having fewer secretions, the pH shifts, which leads to far more likelihood of yeast infections and the like. I mean, you name it. Like, we can go on down the list. Some of the more terrifying parts of this are like osteoporosis. You have a vast increase in chance of osteoporosis or loss of bone mass as a result of menopause. It's rough, man. Like, famous are the hot flashes, but scary is osteoporosis. All right, female cycle continued. The controlling mechanisms are follicle-stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone as regulated by gonadotrophin-releasing hormone, and estrogen released from the ovary itself. I am not going to ask you to recite this to me. I want you to know basic concepts. What is luteinizing hormone for? I've already told you. What is follicle-stimulating hormone for? I've already told you. Understanding that this system is self-regulating just like it is in the male side of things, all right? So the sexual cycle averages about 28 days from start to finish. That's the menstrual cycle. The hormones of the hypothalamus are going to regulate this, i.e. gonadotrophin-releasing hormone. That will result in the pituitary gland releasing certain hormones that regulate the ovaries. And then the ovaries are going to release hormones that regulate the uterus. And then the ovaries are going to have feedback into this whole system. What I'm trying to tell you is it's pretty dadgum complicated, and it's on a feedback mechanism. All right, this is homeostatically regulated. All right, good enough. All right, female cycle. So what we're going to talk about at length here, and our main sort of meat for conversation today is going to be on oogenesis. That would be gamete formation, meiotic division, taking a diploid cell and making haploid cells from it. And again, your diploid cell count is about 20, or jeez, have mercy. Your diploid cell count is exactly 23 pairs of chromosomes, whereas your haploid cell count would be 23 total chromosomes. So what we're going to be doing with oogenesis is we're going to be making egg cells that have 23 total chromosomes. They're gametes. They're gametes. That way you can have a 23 chromosome egg meet up with a 23 chromosome sperm, and that's going to form together to have 46 total chromosomes, or 23 pairs, and that would be a zygote that could then implant into the endometrium of the uterus and lead to pregnancy. Now, a point to be made. In spermatogenesis, we're going to have one spermatogonial cell develop into 4 functional sperm. In oogenesis, we're going to have one initial ovum. Well, I shouldn't say that. One oogonial cell is what we'll say. One oogonial cell develop into a single functioning ovum and 3 non-functioning polar bodies. The goal is very simple here for sperm formation. We're trying to kick off all the cytoplasm we can kick off, whereas in the female reproductive cycle, we're trying to conserve all the cytoplasm into one shot in the dark, one attempt at fertilization. One big healthy egg is going to be produced per month, typically, to lead through this menstrual cycle. There is unequal cytoplasmic distribution. All the cytoplasm stays with the one egg. Now, moving on, we'll talk about the ovarian cycle. Okay, the ovarian cycle is simply looking at what's referred to as the follicular phase, followed by ovulation, followed by a luteal phase, and sort of what's happening where and what hormones are guiding this. And then last but not least, we'll talk about the physical menstrual cycle itself. We're going to look at the changes in the endometrium of the uterus and sort of what happens over that 28-day cycle in response to the given hormones in play. All right, so let's do oogenesis. Oogenesis. So what's happening here is a meiotic division of a cell forming haploid gametes. And again, I've already said this. I'm not going to go into a bunch of detail on it, but the nature of it is that you start out with one oogonial cell at the beginning here. That's going to divide mitotically, kicking off individual primary oocytes, and these primary oocytes will develop into secondary oocytes, what have you. The goal is we're making haploid gametes, okay? And at the end of the day, we're going to have one functioning haploid egg cell that can then be fertilized and lead to a zygote, and we're going to kick off 3 what we call polar bodies. All right, polar bodies. One functioning egg, 3 polar bodies are going to be released here. One egg, 3 polar bodies. The egg keeps all the cytoplasm. The polar bodies are just shedding off any DNA-based material that you don't need. Okay. Now, following this will be a variety of cyclic changes in hormone secretions, and you'll see it soon. Following this will be cyclic changes in the structure of the ovaries and the uterus, and these uterine changes result in that monthly menstrual flow. Now, quick point to be made. The oogonial cells themselves will divide mitotically up until about the 5th month of development in utero for a developing child, again, a baby in mom's uterus itself. At this time, there will be about 5 or 6 million of these. Okay, 5 or 6 million of these. Upon birth, all right, most of these are going to be degenerated, and by the time you hit puberty, there's only about 400,000 left. Okay, so you make lots and lots, and then they slowly break down, sort of whittling out the specific ones that have potential issues or what have you, leading to just a select few being through at puberty, and then you can expect only about 480 or so ovulations to take place with those 400,000 oocytes. So this would be the number of times that a menstrual cycle will occur in the lifespan of a female, and until the cessation of ovulation, i.e. that menopause we talked about previously. Well, that was a really circular way to get at that, but I guess it'll do. Let's go here. All right, the ovarian cycle. So this cycle begins with a 2-week, what's called follicular phase. The follicular phase, what we're talking about here in the ovarian cycle, is we're looking at a primary oocyte developing into a secondary oocyte, developing into a tertiary oocyte, and then followed by ovulation. That's the end of that follicular phase. And then the next period is going to be called the luteal phase, because it's going to be followed up by the development of a corpus luteum, and then the fallout of that corpus luteum slowly degenerating. Now, in and amongst this, a few important points. The whole follicular phase, menstruation itself, ovulation, these are all triggered by these hormones. The whole development of primary oocytes is going to be caused by follicle-stimulating hormone kicking up initially and forming this initial spike, so stimulating the development of these ovarian follicles. And then as we progress, ovulation is going to occur. This is triggered by luteinizing hormone, and then that luteinizing hormone will further trigger the development of a corpus luteum, and then the corpus luteum sort of takes over hormonal roles, if you will, hormonal usages of the menstrual cycle. Okay, so ovarian cycle, follicular phase, ovulation, a given period in time, followed by a luteal phase. Now, when we look at these follicles, it's pretty easy to diagnose who's who. The cortex of the ovary, it's going to be just jam-packed with primordial follicles. They just studded everywhere. They're all over the place. Primary follicles, from my perspective, they look somewhat inflamed. They have an inflamed appearance. They're enlarged by a small amount. Secondary follicles develop an antrum. You can see an opening inside of there. That tells you that's a secondary follicle. And then last but not least, there are mature, or what I would call Graafian follicles. And Graafian follicles have the oocyte inside of there built up onto a stem. And this is the way the follicle will look just prior to ovulation. Okay, so primordial, primary, secondary, Graafian. Right? The luteal phase is fascinating here. What will happen is upon ovulation, when the egg is kicked out, the Graafian follicle will change into what's called a corpus luteum and will swell and get huge, filling up large portions, percentage-wise, of the ovary itself. Now, this corpus luteum is going to start cranking out progesterone like it is going out of style. It is stimulated for becoming the corpus luteum as a result of luteinizing hormone. Okay, luteinizing hormone stimulates corpus luteum to grow and begin to secrete estradiol and progesterone, but it's progesterone that runs the show. It is this massive increase of progesterone produced by the corpus luteum. Let me say that one more good clean time. The corpus luteum produces massive quantities of progesterone, and it's that progesterone produced by the corpus luteum that causes the uterus, the inner lining, the endometrium, to become ready for implantation of a fertilized egg. Okay, no corpus luteum, no progesterone, no baby. All right. In fact, this is going to play a role in how birth control works, but it's a story for another day. Now, in the event there is no pregnancy, in the event there is no implantation of a zygote into the endometrium, this corpus luteum will go through what's called involution. It will degrade and become what's referred to as a corpus albicans. This is a uterine scar. It's a little white spot that'll form up inside the ovary. You can go and look at some histological images of ovaries. These are very obvious. So this will happen by about day 26, 27, 28, somewhere in that neighborhood near the end. And yeah, we have a corpus albicans. Now, as a result of this degrading of the corpus luteum, what you'll see is follicle-stimulating hormone begin to rise again, and that's going to restart the whole system. We're going back. It's a cycle. I wish I could make these one big circle. But when the corpus luteum degrades, becomes corpus albicans, the side effect of this is going to be an increase in follicle-stimulating hormone as progesterone rates dive. So progesterone rates dive, and that's going to cause follicle-stimulating hormone levels to rise, and that's going to lead to a ripening of a new ovarian follicle. Yeah. Now, an interesting point to be made here is that if you have the left ovary ovulate 1 month, you can expect the right ovary to ovulate the next month. They have sort of a recovery period, so one will go, then the next, and the next, and the next. So it is, they alternate. Yeah. All right. Here are some really nice images of the uterine tube here, the fimbriae sort of reaching out to receive an egg being released from an ovary. Again, it was thought that the egg was burst forth and it's kind of spit out into the fallopian tube. That is not the case. In your textbook, it sort of mentions the bursting of the ovarian follicles. That is not the way this works. It's a very slow, controlled mechanism, as it turns out, slowly extruding the egg, and then the fimbriae are here with their ciliary action, pulling fluid in and helping carry that egg into the fallopian tubes. The phrasing in your book cracked me up. The fimbriae caress the ovary with synchronicity, with the heartbeat, sort of every time the heart beats, pulling at the ovary, pulling those eggs in, i.e. preventing ectopic pregnancies in the grand scheme. Yeah, they are ciliated. The whole concept here is these ovarian tubes are ciliated. Now, an interesting nuance to this is that the oocyte, when it's released, only has a day, maybe 12 hours, not more than 24 hours, to meet a sperm and become fertilized, or it is non-viable. All right? Again, do I have a fallopian tube floating around here someplace? I don't. The idea is you get a very short period of time. When the egg's released, it's got to be fertilized quickly, or it ain't going to happen. All right? You have a very, very short period of time. And mix into this the concept that sperm only live maybe 1-2 days inside the female reproductive tract, so it's a very narrow window. I always used to tell folks, right? I always used to say, you know, it's a miracle that any of you exist, because this is a complicated process. You know, getting sperm in at the appropriate moment, having the egg released at the appropriate moment, having them meet at the appropriate location in the fallopian tube, really rare. I'm going to disagree with that now. Having grown up and had children of my own, I'm here to tell you that this happens with regularity. Okay, this happens with regularity. So be careful out there, even if you have an extreme knowledge of this cycle and how the cycle works, even if you have an extraordinary amount of general cognition of how these cycles function, things still happen. I love the little man to death. He was a surprise, okay? So be careful out there is what I'm trying to tell you, folks. Be careful out there. And I would never ever do anything to not have any. He's wonderful and perfect in every way. I'm just telling you to be careful out there. All right, moving on, menstrual cycle. So the menstrual cycle itself is going to be broken down into a few sub-phases. This is going to be the menstrual phase, where the uterine lining is being shed. Think of this as when the uterus is bleeding internally, followed by a proliferative phase. Proliferative simply means growing in number, or cells growing and developing. So you're going to have a slow development of cells. Then ovulation occurs and the corpus luteum pops up. And again, think about that corpus luteum. It starts cranking out progesterone like it's going out of style. And what that does is it causes the secretory phase of the menstrual cycle. Here, what we're going to have is the uterine lining, the endometrium, becomes super fluffy and happy and full of blood vessels. This is where it's capable of having implantation of a zygote. All right, so this is where implantation can take place. And in the event that that does not happen, the corpus luteum goes through involution and breaks down. And as a side effect of that, progesterone levels drop like a rock, and we begin the premenstrual phase, leading back to the beginning of the cycle. All right, man, I wish I could make these big circles. Like, it would make so much more sense. But that's how this works. All right, that's how this works. That secretory phase with progesterone as a result of the corpus luteum, that matters. Oh man, here we go. So female sexual response, same kind of concepts as we did with the male sexual response. This is all peer-reviewed scientific research by Masters and Johnson. What legends, back in the 60s, no one had ever contemplated trying to do the research they did at their time, and we should be thankful for the knowledge we have, because pretty much the whole rest of this lecture is all based off of their work, all right? So again, they broke down intercourse into 4 basic phases. These phases are excitement, plateau, orgasm, and resolution. And again, we will use terms like coitus or copulation in our descriptors here. So let's talk about the female sexual response. We can start out with this as an unstimulated side here. So what's happening is the uterus is at rest, sort of laying against the bladder. The internal structures, like the vagina, for example, the labia minora, will be low in blood flow, if you will, at rest. Then upon excitement, what will happen is these structures will engorge with blood. The clitoris engorges with blood. The labia minora engorge with blood. The vaginal opening engorges with blood. And the side effect of that is a lot of transudate, moisturization taking place within the vagina, lubricating it. The Bartholin's glands produce fluid, lubricating the outer opening of the vagina, and further, the inner portion of the vagina will open up and form almost an antrum for semen to build up in the event of copulation. Okay, and what you'll find is the uterus is going to tilt back off of the bladder, so it's more or less a straight shot into the uterus itself. Now, during plateau, think of this as the act of copulation. What's going to occur here primarily is the vagina will have a mild constriction, and what that's going to do is facilitate orgasm. All right, so what else do we have here? The cervix is withdrawn from the vagina. We're going to form this antrum inside of here. All the structures are high in blood flow. This is all very obvious, and that's going to lead up to orgasm. So upon orgasm, what you're going to find is a series of rhythmic contractions taking place within all the musculature of the lower abdomen. The vagina has rhythmic contractions, the uterus has rhythmic contractions, the perineum has rhythmic contractions, you name it. And what this is going to do is, the thought from Masters and Johnson was that what this would do is it would pull semen into the uterus. Now, boy, let me tell you, they really tried to document this and failed. Okay, Masters and Johnson really tried to document it. They did some pretty wild experiments. One comes to mind where they had laboratory mice in copulo, and the moment that copulation had come to cessation, they would cut the heads off of these poor critters and then dissect them and look at their internal anatomy and see what had moved where. And what they found was, almost without any question, sperm were found deep in the uterus. Okay, deep in the uterus, and their assumption was that there was almost like a suction action taking place with the rhythmic contractions of the uterus that would dip down into a pool of semen and pull that semen up into the uterus. Your book even speaks to this to some degree, but Masters and Johnson didn't feel they had quite enough data to say with absolute clarity that that's what happened. They just assume that's what's happening, and that's good enough for me. All right. And then that's going to be followed by this resolution phase where everything goes back to its normal resting state. Now, interestingly, in the female side of things, there is no refractory period. Again, think about males. A male is physiologically incapable of copulation for a period of minutes to hours to days after a series of copulation taking place, whereas on the female side of things, there is no refractory period. All right. Yeah, good enough. All right, and that's going to be followed by fertilization. So what happens here? Interestingly, when orgasm occurs, there will be millions and millions and millions of sperm released. Okay, millions of sperm. Nearly all of them are going to be destroyed in one way, shape, or form. Okay, virtually none, very few. Very small numbers, about 100, generally speaking, are going to make their way all the way into the fallopian tubes to potentially come into contact with an egg cell. So, countless millions are going to be produced, but very few actually make the trip. Very few. So, why is that? Well, lots of these are going to be leaked out of the vagina post-copulo. They're going to be leaked out, if you will, as a process of they're supposed to congeal into a solid mass. Some of these do not. Many of these are going to be killed by the acidic environment within the vagina. Again, the seminal fluids are supposed to be basic and capable of moderating the acidity of the vagina, but lots of sperm die as a result of the acidic environment within the vagina. Lots of them can't make it through the cervix. It's a difficult task getting through the mucosal lining, if you will, of the cervix, so lots of them can't make that trip. Then they get into the uterus. Now, here's an interesting comment. Your book would say that some go the wrong way and some don't, so there will be an egg on this side, but not on the opposing side. But a lot of research has shown that for whatever reason, and we don't know the mechanism offhand, sperm tend to go the direction that the egg is coming from. Okay, by and large, they tend to know which way to turn, into which fallopian tube to travel. So by the time all of this occurs, getting into the uterine tubes, very few are actually going to make the trip. Now, again, let's make the point that post-ovulation, An oocyte's only viable for a very short period of time. The sperm are only viable for a very short period of time. So fertilization has to take place very quickly for a functioning zygote to be formed. Okay, a nice 2N full complement of chromosomes zygote to be formed. A 23 chromosome sperm meets up with a 23 chromosome egg. They will merge together, forming a zygote which has 23 pairs of chromosomes. They will be 2N. Now, I am not going to go into detail on this because we don't have the time and I don't want to butcher you. But what I want you to get, my main goal for you to understand is that the sperm have an acrosome. This is that end, the tip of the sperm itself. So you've got this tail with this mid piece here that's going to use the sugars from the seminal vesicles to power itself and get to the egg. But then the acrosome, this tip here, once the sperm becomes activated, which is a whole nother story, it has the ability to use enzymes here to burrow its way into the egg. And long story short, once that occurs, a chemical reaction takes place when one single sperm makes its way into the egg. A chemical reaction occurs to prevent more than one sperm from getting in. So we prevent what's called polyspermy. Basically, this causes a calcium cascade that breaks down all of the receptors for sperm on the egg cell so that only the one sperm remains. He who remains, if you will, would be all that is left here. All right. What else do I want to say here? So when that occurs, the nucleus of that sperm will swell in size greatly and form what's called a male pronucleus. That will then merge with the female pronucleus, and we'll have that full complement of chromosomes in our functioning zygote. Now, this occurs out here in the ampullae of the fallopian tube. Okay, boom, there it is. After a couple of days, it's making its way through the fallopian tube, dividing mitotically almost instantaneously after zygote formation. The zygote begins to divide mitotically. After 3 days, it's making its way in. Here we go at 4 days. And then at 7 days, it's going to implant itself into the endometrium. It's going to begin to pull nutrients from the endometrium to help sustain itself. And then this group of cells will develop into the baby that we think of as a 9-month fetus. All right. Now, implantation is done after 12 days post-release of the egg. Okay, 12 days post-release, we got implantation. It is on. And now what's got to happen is you have to prevent the menstrual cycle from shedding the lining of that endometrium. You shed the lining of the endometrium, no baby. Okay, so how do we do this? A hormone is released called human chorionic gonadotropin. I expect you to know that. Human chorionic gonadotropin, HCG, and this hormone keeps the corpus luteum doing its job and keeps the endometrium good and functional. How do we do a pregnancy test? We look for human chorionic gonadotropin. If this is in the system, somebody's with child, and that's how we know. All right, so we can get really early pregnancy tests by looking for this hormone. All right, let me throw some terms at you. We're near the end here. So pregnancy, events that occur from fertilization until the infant is born, gestation period, roughly 280 days, 9 months, what we tend to think about. A conceptus is that early developing offspring, the zygote, if you will. An embryo is the conceptus from fertilization through 8 weeks. A fetus is going to be from week 9 through birth, basically near around where we can identify sex. And then an infant or infancy is from birth to about 2 years of age. Just some good terms for you to have a grasp of. Now, a full-term fetus will be head down and back out. Okay, back out. You don't want the spinal cord resting against mom's spinal cord. That makes it very hard to escape. You want the back out and the head down. This is the standard way in which we give birth. Yeah, so a few terms. Term is the duration of pregnancy. A trimester is a 3-month period. Yeah, I think that'll do. Now, note that this uterus is incredibly muscular. Note how large it gets, running all the way from the xiphoid process down to the pelvic bone, and look how everything is pushed away and moved into weird locations as a result of this. All right, this is a real influence on mom's system. So let's talk about some of those influences real quick. Mom's basal metabolic rate is going to rise by about 15% during the second half of gestation. As a result of this, appetite tends to be strongly stimulated. You eat more because you're eating for two, and you tend to pack on a few more pounds, about 24 pounds of healthy average weight gain. Totally normal, totally fine. Mom's blood volume, now this is crazy, will go up by about 30% during pregnancy. That can be up to about 2 liters. So think about a 2-liter Dr. Pepper, all right, the finest drink in the world, 2-liter Dr. Pepper. That's the amount of blood increase over basal that you'll see during late stages of pregnancy, which is insane from my perspective. Mom's cardiac output is going to rise by 30 to 40%, which is totally normal and accepted. I mean, think about mom's pumping blood for 2 at that stage, not going into the fetus directly, but through the placenta. Mom's blood glucose levels are going to rise because she's trying to provide energy for that growing, developing offspring. Mom is going to be breathing more deeply, so tidal volume goes up by about 40%. And then, again, another interesting number, glomerular filtration rate increases by about half. 50% increase, followed by an elevated urine output. Why? Because mom is processing nitrogenous waste for 2 at that stage. So that means that she's going to have to be running glomerular filtration at a much higher rate. Also, that means she's going to be producing more urine because she's having to get rid of nitrogenous waste for 2 at that stage. And also, this means frequent urination because where is the bladder in this conversation? It is smushed down almost flat at the base of the pelvic cavity. Yeah. All right, labor and contractions. Just a few more things. We'll call it a day. So the fetus is kind of a passive player in its own birthing process. Now, the activity of the fetus can elicit some contractile properties, but generally speaking, a passive player. So pushing out that offspring is a side effect of contractions of mom's uterus and abdominal muscles in play here. Yeah. So these labor contractions are going to start out about 30 minutes apart, and then when you are almost to deliver that kid, you're looking at every minute to 3 minutes. Now, there will be a brief relaxation period, followed by a period of contractions, followed by a brief relaxation period, etc., 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 until you have the offspring. And there's a reason for this. That period of contraction of that uterine tissue is going to pull all the blood out of the muscles that are there, and it's going to really hamper the fetus's ability to survive. So you need those breaks in between so that everything can somewhat recover. Okay, so you want to have that recovery period built into this. Now, most of the contractions take place in the fundus of the uterus and some in the body of the uterus, which makes perfect sense. We want to squeeze from the top, pushing the kid out. We don't want to squeeze the cervix. That's counterproductive. We want the cervix to pretty much go away. We want to push down and out. Push down and out. Yeah. Now, this is important. I expect you to know this. This is a link between the nervous system and the endocrine system, specifically a hormone called oxytocin. This cycle is important. So what happens? Well, when the kid is pushed down and impacts the cervix, what's going to occur is pressure against the cervix causes a nervous transmission that travels to the brain, and it causes the pituitary gland in the brain to secrete oxytocin. Now, 3rd trimester of pregnancy, the uterus builds lots of oxytocin receptors. It becomes what we call upregulated to oxytocin. So what will happen is when oxytocin hits the uterus, it causes contraction, which pushes the kid's head against the cervix, which causes a nervous transmission to the brain, which causes more oxytocin faster than before, resulting in more uterine contractions. So how do we get from 30 minutes to 1 minute between contractions? Because this cycle gets faster and faster and faster and faster until that offspring's made its way out. All right, and that's just how this works. And the contractions are kind of fascinating. So, what do I want to say here? So they are, again, driven by the musculature of the uterus, and as well as this, what we call this Valsalva maneuver. Doctor says push, so mom takes a breath and pushes, all right? And that's going to help push that kid out. Now, the pain felt in labor, at least initially, is due to a low oxygen situation, ischemia, in the myometrium. So the contraction pulls all the blood out of the myometrium, the muscle of the uterus, and when you take blood away from muscle, it causes a low oxic environment, and it causes pain. So the pain is a side effect of a low oxygen environment, all right, a low oxygen environment. Yeah, decreasing uterine contraction or circulation. And I would say that, just to make a point, this is my amazing wife and the 3 children that she has had. Our kids, I love them to death. My wife is amazing. She had all 3 kids, no medication. She is just an absolute champ. And she'd tell you that it wasn't that terrible. All right, everybody has a different birth story, but she'd tell you that it wasn't that terrible. Because when you are going through this birthing process, now my first comment here is people have been having babies for a long, long time. All right? A long, long time. It's part of the reason we exist is because people have been having babies for a long, long time. When the act of delivery is occurring, the brain releases endorphins. And what those endorphins do is they decrease the pain that you're capable of feeling. So I witnessed this process 3 times, and I'm here to tell you that she wasn't very happy about it, but she wasn't suffering either. All right, specifically with this one here, if this one was what pregnancy is, people be having babies left and right. Because the doctor said push, and she pushed, and about a minute and a half later, we had a baby in our arms. And my wife was up walking around in 15 minutes, like nothing had happened. It's the craziest thing you've ever seen. This is a natural process. What I'm trying to tell you is all of this that we've just discussed is a natural process, and the body tends to do it almost autonomically. We don't even process the concept of it. And that, folks, that is where we're going to end our conversation on Anatomy 2. I hope you've benefited from this time we've spent together, and good luck on your exams. All right, thank you so much, and I look forward to you doing extraordinarily well on your final. Thank you.